He was the most popular radio commentator in the country. Tens of millions of Americans tuned in each week to hear the words of a parish priest from Royal Oak, Michigan.
In many ways, I think Father Coughlin is the first celebrity cleric of the 20th century.
But this religious leader wasn't just sharing his faith with the audience, he was sharing his politics too. For more than a decade, Father Coughlin captivated the nation and inspired his followers to take drastic steps in his name. This is Star-Spangled Fascism, The Priest and the Christian Front, Part 1.
When you write about this era and you write about fascism in America, a lot of people want to find modern doppelgangers for these historical figures. There's no modern doppelganger for Charles Coughlin. And I don't think that we ever will have somebody that powerful with that much of a reach again.
I'm historian Bradley W. Hart, author of the award-winning book, Hitler's American Friends. In this podcast, we're examining fascist leaders and movements that have emerged here in the United States over the past century. We'll look at what fueled their authoritarian ambitions, the supporters who flocked to them, and the Americans who stood in their way. In the next 2 episodes, we're exploring the life and career of a man who is one of the most famous names in the country, Father Charles Coughlin. Even today, Father Coughlin is one of the most well-known names from 1930s America. You just heard Rachel Maddow talking about just how unique and important a figure he was in his own time. I've encountered Father Coughlin a lot in my research. His writings turn up everywhere, even in the collections of U.S. congressmen and senators who subscribe to his newspaper and listen to his radio show. To learn more about this fascinating and influential figure, I'm speaking to Charles Gallagher, professor of history at Boston College and the author of the fantastic book, Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten Story of the Christian Front. Charles, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Great to be here with you.
We're talking today about Father Charles Coughlin, one of the most interesting figures, in my opinion, in the 1930s, a critical figure in media history, a man who generated a radio audience larger than probably any in history for any commentator before or even since. A man who had influence in the White House, he had influence in Congress. In fact, he had supporters who were members of Congress. And a man who really began increasingly over the 1930s to articulate views that were favorable towards the Third Reich and favorable towards fascism as an ideology. One fascinating thing about this figure who had such an influence in the United States as well was that he was actually Canadian. Father Charles Coughlin was born in Hamilton, Ontario in 1891 to an Irish Catholic family. His mother was very devout and was a huge childhood influence on him. He graduated from college in Toronto, apparently was a fantastic student, and actually went on to study at the postgraduate level as well, was seen as, in some ways, as a rising star in the church in this period. And then he was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1916 in the Basilian Order. Now, the Basilian Order is one that many of our listeners are probably not familiar with. And Charles, we should say that you yourself are a Catholic priest as well, which I think puts a really interesting lens on your scholarship. Can you tell our listeners what the Basilian Order is and why this was so important as a moment in Father Coughlin's life?
So this order, organized originally in Europe, transplanted to North America in the 19th century, had a ministry by and large that was centered around education, seminary education. And as we look at Father Coughlin's life trajectory, there's every kind of indication to think that he himself might have been called in his priesthood to be a teacher.
So as a young priest, what is Coughlin's reputation within the church? I mean, this is a man who, by my understanding, is really regarded as, in some ways, a rising star. He certainly is academically gifted. What is his reputation in the church prior to him really entering the public consciousness in the 1920s?
He's well known as a pastor, well known as a public speaker, well known as a homilist. He would have been known at the neighborhood level as a minister, a pastor, a priest. So he would have been known to a large local circle of religious people who were practical Catholics, in other words, going to Mass on Sundays.
So in 1923, the Basilian Order that Coughlin is part of really undergoes a major change on the orders of Rome, effectively. It goes from being a common life society to a monastic order. What is Coughlin's reaction to this? he leaves the order effectively because of this change.
Correct. Yeah, he makes the decision to leave the order, and that's because in that the mechanics of that process necessitates that the members of that order must take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, an ordinary priest that is not a member of a religious order will take a promise of celibacy, and they will be encouraged to live an austere life. But all of those priests can hold their own property. A priest outside of vows can maintain their own funds. They can receive inheritances from their family. They can actually even generate money through intangibles such as stocks and keep that as their own private personal property. So in this early period, Coughlin has a choice to make. Bishops both in Canada and in the United States gave the option for members of the Basilians who did not want to take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to actually leave that congregation and become a priest in the diocese where they would situate, but then being beholden to that particular bishop, which took them in to the particular diocese.
And what's so interesting is that later in his career, we will see he certainly has not taken a vow of poverty. And in fact, Coughlin will become fairly wealthy. But a lot of what we're talking about here, in fact, all of it is when he's still in Canada, of course, just right across the border in the larger Detroit metro area. When does he actually make the move to the U.S., and why does he make the move across the river?
So in 1926, he receives an offer from the Archdiocese of Detroit to receive him, and he decides he does not want to remain in the order, mainly because of those vows. And the other issue is that a lot of the Basilian priests in Ontario would often come across the bridge into Michigan, into the United States to do pastoral work on weekends. So he felt very comfortable being in the United States, and the Bishop Michael Gallagher in Detroit at the time, no relation to yours truly, he felt very comfortable accepting Coughlin because he had an excellent reputation as a student and as a leader in his seminary vocation and in his work in Canada already. He seemed like a very good bet to become a very productive, a very pastoral, a very effective priest for any diocese that would take him. And so that's why I think Detroit snapped him up. Detroit was a growing diocese. It needed young priests. So he just came across the border, and it seemed like a natural fit from the beginning.
One of the things that Coughlin immediately confronts, though, is anti-Catholic prejudice. And it's anti-Catholic prejudice that really motivates him to make the move from purely a religious orientation to engaging with the wider community. What is the role of the Ku Klux Klan and changing his views of what his mission should be?
As soon as Coughlin comes across the border in the mid-1920s, what happens is that he has an experience of the KKK burning a wooden cross on the front lawn of his church, a church and rectory compound in Detroit. And this not only aggravates Coughlin, but it makes him feel like he's being particularly discriminated against. It allows him to have a martyr complex that will only grow with time, and it allows him to think about new ways for him to voice his opposition as a victim, what he sees as a victim of Protestant prejudice against Catholics in the United States. And so eventually this moves him to find an avenue for his oratory to meet with this new medium of radio. In order to meet that broadcast need, he decides that he will try his hand at fundraising. And his first fundraising effort, he wants to build a giant stone cross, a 40-foot high stone cross that will never be susceptible to being burned. And then he starts a fundraising campaign to build this giant stone and cement structure, which is 40 feet in the air, and it's still there today in Royal Oak, Michigan at the church. It was the first thing that he built, and it was also his first hand in fundraising.
And that's what's so fascinating is that for our listeners in the Detroit area, they probably know that Father Coughlin's church is still there. It is the Shrine of the Little Flower in Royal Oak, Michigan. So 1926, Father Coughlin makes the move from being a parish priest to hitting the airwaves with this brand new technology, really, of radio. For a lot of our listeners, radio is, I compare it to the tech industry today, or even in the early 2000s. This was a very exciting new medium. So Coughlin, I think, is making himself a very trendy figure in a lot of ways. And my reading of him, too, is that he's trying to make himself, in some ways, a cool figure in the community. Babe Ruth, as I recall, goes out to the Shrine of the Little Flower to help him raise money for his construction. And so he really becomes, I think, this phenomenon in the Royal Oak community. What is he building himself into here?
In many ways, I think Father Coughlin is the first celebrity cleric of the 20th century. He's clearly the first celebrity priest. He's a precursor to Billy Graham, who would have been a celebrity cleric of the late 20th century. He understands that, much like the Canadian church, the American church is an immigrant church. They're quickly overcoming their minority status through the sheer dint of numbers. They still feel like outsiders in the country that's supposed to be welcoming them. And I think Coughlin knows that particularly well. And when he moves onto the public stage, and when he is seen next to Babe Ruth, and when he is shaking the hands of high-ranking politicians, he knows that he doesn't just represent the officer class of the Roman Catholic Church. He represents the immigrant class, the working class of a church that's struggling for acceptance. And he becomes a symbol for every immigrant working class Catholic who goes to church on Sunday. They identify with their priests. He knows the psychology of the American immigrant church, and he uses it to his own personal advantage.
And now, Father Coughlin. Christianity, as you know, has its very definite doctrine and dogma on the subject of justice. Christianity teaches for an individual who has been unjustly exploited, who has been unjustly denied the conveniences and necessities of this life, to practice the moral virtues. Hence, Christianity has openly and consistently inveighed against the exploitation of the poor, the concentration of wealth, the underpayment of labor, and the usury in the money markets.
And I think you can see this so clearly when you listen to the recordings of his radio broadcasts. And for our listeners' benefit, Father Coughlin was on Sunday afternoons. He deliberately chose a time slot where his listeners could go to Mass and then go home and listen to him effectively in the afternoon, almost like a second Mass. What are Coughlin's broadcasts like for the listener? I find them to be incredibly compelling.
Many people have commented on his mellifluous voice, his cadence, his lilt of Irish that comes across. It's in many ways mesmerizing as he begins his oration.
Were Christianity to be silent, she would be a coward. Were she to be a compromiser, she would be no better, perchance, than those who say peace, peace, when there is no peace, watching her subjects going into desolation and into the valley of destruction. Consequently, it has become the burden of a Catholic priest, in this instance and in many other instances, perhaps to speak of subjects upon which Christian pulpits too long have been silent.
He's very good at creating and moving to crescendo in order to accentuate a point, either religious or political. He's very good at using musical backgrounds to accentuate his oratory. He's especially adept at using gesture. He lulls the listener into a sense of security before he moves upward in intensity, and it had a spellbinding effect on the listeners because no one had ever heard a speaker like that.
So Father Coughlin starts out on the Detroit radio station WJR. He's effectively a local radio host. And I think if he had taken the exact format that you're describing national and kept his focus on religious matters, we might well have a very different impression of Father Coughlin today. He might well have gone down as a very different type of historical figure. But as it turns out, by 1929, the owner of WJR is encouraging Coughlin to move his oratory into the political realm as well. So in 1930, Father Coughlin is picked up by CBS. This is the CBS radio network, we should say, one of the nation's original and biggest radio networks. But just a year later, this relationship breaks down because CBS wants to review Father Coughlin's radio speeches before they're given, which one would think is their prerogative as the owner of the network, and Coughlin doesn't agree to it. So within a year, he effectively is off the CBS radio network. But then Father Coughlin moves to what I see as somewhat of a brilliant strategy of piecing together time on independent stations where he is actually buying the time with the caveat that he can say whatever he wants effectively. So by the election of 1932, Father Coughlin has stepped onto the national stage in a big way. He steps directly into presidential politics. He backs FDR as the candidate who's going to end the Depression.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
In fact, he says that FDR is being directed by God, and if FDR is not elected, that there will be ruin effectively. But by 1934, just 2 years later, Coughlin has completely soured on FDR.
View the New Deal in 1933 and 34. Did it revere the Bill of Rights for which men had bled and died? Oh, no. It took the Bill of Rights as it's taking our Constitution today, and tore it into shreds, and handed over the spending power from the purse of the people, from the purse of Congress, to the President of the United States. One step backward, one step towards dictatorship.
What do we make of this very abrupt move into politics in the biggest possible way in the United States, and then suddenly changing his mind just really 2 years later?
They both see each other as potential political allies. We have to keep in mind that by this time, Coughlin has millions, not thousands, but millions of listeners in his radio network. As a Protestant, Roosevelt views the Catholic Church hierarchically. He views it as almost in the time where he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where an order is given from on high, or there's this hierarchy and the subordinates move accordingly. So he sees Coughlin as a potential political ally in terms of what he views as the Catholic voting bloc. It's about electoral politics. For Roosevelt, it's about what was then known as the Catholic vote, which actually may have had some credence to it. Early on, Coughlin views Roosevelt's New Deal as being in sympathy with Catholic social teaching. And so he sees Catholic social teaching as the vehicle for him to be able to arrive in front of the White House. And what happens in the mid-1930s is that Coughlin does end up at the White House, but he's asked to enter through the back door, literally. After this meeting, he is informed that he will not have the level of clout within the administration that he desired, or in fact that he craved. And so he turns against Roosevelt. He left and stormed off and eventually creates his own political party.
Father Coughlin won't take this slight from the president in stride. Rather than keep backing FDR, he's actually about to start his very own political party to take on the U.S. political establishment. It's a move that will put the country's most listened to radio commentator on a path to supporting European fascism, and start some of his most diehard supporters on the road to preparing for armed confrontation. So Coughlin, we should mention, is consistently anti-socialist, deeply anti-communist, and he's not shy about his anti-communist views.
Absolutely. So keep in mind, too, that in the 1920s, late 1920s, what's pushing his anti-communist views is for lack of a better term, because they didn't have the language to describe it, was Catholic persecution taking place in Mexico. And so what was going on there, Mexico had gone through a number of revolutions, even since 1917, and since the early 10s and into the teens. And the governments that ended up taking hold in Mexico tended to be more socialist in nature. And one of the things that they did was confiscation of church properties. Back then, when Coughlin was talking, Catholics knew about it intimately because they felt that and this is a term that you never hear these days, but was popular then, their co-religionists were being persecuted in Mexico. St. Augustine Miguel Pro, who was unjustly, without any due process, put in front of a firing squad of Mexican army soldiers and shot dead, shouting at the top of his voice, "Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King." It was visceral to Coughlin that this Christian martyr was slaughtered, not by Mexicans, not by any political faction, but by socialists. And by socialists, a socialist and a communist were the same thing to Father Coughlin. That vigor against communism metastasizes through the 1920s into the 1930s.
For regular listeners to the podcast, we did a series on William Dudley Pelley, the founder of the Silver Legion, but he has something of a similar experience in some ways. He, as a young man, goes off to Siberia during the Russian Revolution, witnesses atrocities against the Russian peasantry by communists. But for him as well, this is really the moment at which it seems that he begins making the move towards anti-Semitism. And of course, Father Coughlin will become notorious for his anti-Semitism. Where do you see the anti-Semitism emerging for Father Coughlin? Is it through this anti-socialist feeling that he's developing?
He becomes more and more concerned that gold is being hoarded by banks, and those banks are owned by Jews controlling the gold markets. And he feels that the concept of usury, of the charging of very high interest rates by banks for the lending of money, is something that is against Christian principles, and that Christians are on the receiving end of these high interest rates.
So to give our audience a sense of how influential Father Coughlin is, this is a man who most historians estimate was doing an audience between 20 and 30 million people a week at his peak, really, in the mid to late 1930s. So he has a massive radio audience on a weekly basis. He's receiving about 100,000 letters a day. He's receiving donations from all over the country pouring into the Shrine of the Little Flower, where he has a full team of staffers processing them effectively. He is now, as you say, being seen as the voice of an entire community, perhaps the most prominent Catholic voice really in the country. And he also starts his own newspaper. He has a newspaper called Social Justice that is distributed in major cities that's putting his message out there on a regular basis. One thing, again, reminder for our listeners that I think is very important, Father Coughlin is Canadian. He constitutionally can't run for president. But in 1936, he really starts his own political party effectively, and he backs a man named William Lemke, who is running against FDR. He's made the move now from being a priest to entering politics, to entering actually electoral politics. But starting a political party to run your preferred candidate against the President of the United States is a step even beyond that. What's he thinking with this step in 1936? Does he think he's actually going to get Lemke elected?
Yeah, so I just want to accentuate a little bit about what you said about his numbers. You indicated about 25 to 30 million listeners. There were only 120 million Americans. He's reaching 1/5 of the American population once a week for a full hour. He wants to mix it up politically. I don't think he's thinking outside of the box. I think it's an obvious thing for him to do when you have that much reach. People are listening to the Fireside Chats by Roosevelt, but they're also listening to the Little Flower Hour of Power, as it was colloquially called. And he feels he can get the electoral impact that he needs. Lemke knows that he's just a placeholder. And I think everybody is supposed to know that you're really voting for Father Coughlin when you vote for the Union Party, as it was called. It's a very shrewd political move, and it's not a political move that comes out of nowhere, and just because he's not successful in it doesn't mean that he doesn't have or didn't have political ambitions.
But it does not go well for him. Of course, the Union Party is completely shellacked, I think we might say, at the polls in 1936. And it seems to me that Coughlin undergoes a period of what we might call depression today following this. How does he feel about this, as you say, failure politically by a man who's reaching a fifth of American households on a weekly basis? What does he think?
The whole medium of radio is uncertain. Listenership meant traction. But whether that intellectual traction, whether that conversation that comes over the airwaves can motivate a person to the ballot box, that had never been tried before, except with this National Union of Social Justice Party. The lesson is it has much less traction in terms of motivation than we thought. And it's Coughlin that leads us to the answer to that question. Yes, he fails miserably, but prior to this, it was anybody's guess whether those radio waves could move anyone toward a ballot box.
So, of course, up until now, we've been talking really exclusively about the United States. But, of course, this is an era in which there's a lot of important things happening overseas as well. The 1936 election, Roosevelt wins overwhelmingly. But this is the period where events in Nazi Germany are really beginning to accelerate. And so Coughlin, coming off this electoral defeat in late 1936, we're about to enter the period where tensions with Nazi Germany are going to begin to accelerate. And from my reading of this, tell me if I'm wrong here, Coughlin's rhetoric seems to darken fairly considerably when we get to 1937, 1938, whether it's related to this electoral loss that he's experienced or whether it's relating to international events. It seems to me that his radio broadcasts increasingly take a fairly dark turn. What does he begin talking about here in the 1937-38 period?
Yeah, in that period, he starts praising fascist political movements in Italy, in Germany. He starts taking more notice of the international situation overseas. In many ways, there are populist aspects to both the rise of fascism and Nazism. That, again, I think strikes a chord with who Coughlin is. He becomes mesmerized with the kind of full-blown anti-Semitism, the racial anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party in particular. And while he doesn't start mouthing or replicating that, it's clear through his broadcast that he's in sympathy more and more with the style of anti-Semitism which is emerging from the European situation.
We are Christian insofar as we believe in Christ's principle of love your neighbor as yourself, and with that principle, I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it.
I think it's a reaction to his obliteration in electoral politics. He's searching for a new way to become relevant. And it's clear that the American political system has cast him aside. And so I think he's looking for new sponsors here. And what's emerging on the international horizon is a sponsorship by the parties that are gaining in momentum through the force of their ideology.
And just to be clear for our audience, is Father Coughlin openly advocating dictatorship? Is he advocating overthrowing the government?
Well, it's unclear. He's not personally advocating either, but he's writing editorials, he's giving speeches which in tone are sympathetic to the dictators. He's also allowing propaganda ministers from both the Mussolini regime and from the Hitler regime to, in the case of the Mussolini regime, to publish in his newspaper. And he's also allowing the propaganda minister for Hitler's organizations to praise him publicly in Germany. He's not disavowing that praise.
And one of the stranger finds that I made in researching my book was an account by an American student who was studying in Germany in this period and had gone to a German beer hall and was told by a German there that Father Coughlin would make a good pope. So Coughlin was known in Nazi Germany. He was a figure that, as you say, was praised by the regime and appeared in their propaganda broadcasts as well. But in the United States, Coughlin begins changing his political orientation from electoral politics to creating what we might call a grassroots movement. And of course, this is a grassroots movement that he will call the Christian Front. What is the Christian Front? What is Coughlin's idea with this organization?
What Coughlin was seeing happening, particularly in the Spanish Civil War, was that the socialist/communist governments that arrived in Europe in the mid to late 1930s called themselves Popular Front government. They indicated that they were open to democracy. They claimed that they were arbiters of democracy. But in reality, they were police states based on Marxist, communist, Leninist principles. Coughlin was aware of that because they were persecuting Catholics. The Popular Front government in Spain was the communist government in Spain, which was setting fire to churches and throwing priests up against firing squads. 10% of the priests in the Diocese of Madrid were shot by firing squad. This is a real kind of war against the institutional church. And when he creates the Christian Front, he says that, well, if the communists can pick up guns and eliminate Catholics through military force, then the Christians and the Catholics should have their own mechanism by which they can overthrow a tyrannical government should a tyrannical government come into power.
We thank you, communists, for giving the religious people of this nation an opportunity to arouse themselves, to unite themselves for God and country. The Christian Front is no longer a dream. It is a reality in America. A reality that grows stronger, more courageous, and more determined under the threat of your ideological invasion.
And in his view, a communist government was a tyrannical government, that Catholics and Christians are well within their right to use violent force to overthrow a tyrannical government.
And that idea of using violent force to overthrow the government soon leads some of Father Coughlin's followers to get ready to do just that. In our next episode, The Priest and the Christian Front Part 2, we'll look at the armed group that emerges behind the veil of the Catholic faith and starts preparing for armed rebellion. And we'll talk about the stunning terrorist plot they nearly set into motion.
The Christian Front started caching weapons. They started building bombs.
We will fight you shoulder to shoulder and cheek to jowl. Rest assured, we'll fight you and we'll win.
Coughlin, he's orchestrating this. He's having these foot soldiers, which he recruits, do the dirty work, and he doesn't soil his fingertips.
Our special thanks to Charles Gallagher, author of the great book Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten Story of the Christian Front. This program was edited by Brian Fantinelli, mixed and mastered by Joseph Powers, and executive produced by Brendan Gokel. Be sure to subscribe to the Star-Spangled Fascism podcast wherever you get your podcasts, on our YouTube page, and follow us now on social media. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Dr. B.W. Hart. I'll be posting previews from our upcoming episodes there, and feel free to leave your comments. If you have a question about the podcast, email us at questions@starspangledfascismpodcast.com. I'm Bradley W. Hart. Thank you for listening.